Ladies and gentlemen, a most hearty welcome to today's virtual concours to benefit UNICEF. The class we're going to talk about are Crumpet cars, so named because the late, great Sir Stirling Moss referred to ladies of interest to him as Crumpet. And every single car in this lineup has been driven by him. On the panel today, we have Doug Nye, doyen of motorsport writers, whose books are researched from original documents, press and photographs, and have become instant Bibles for his readers. We have Bill Warner, who has founded and been CEO of the Amelia Island Concours in Florida for 25 years. It's a do not miss occasion every year. In 2015, Sir Stirling Moss was his guest for the second time at Amelia Island. And finally, we have Philip Porter, who runs Porter Press International, publishing books on subjects as diverse as a 1932 Alfa Romeo Monza to the first 50 years of designer Gordon Murray's contribution to motoring. Plus, he's done 4 books and 1 biography on Sir Stirling Moss himself. So let's hear what they have to say about Sir Stirling Moss and his cars. And perhaps, Doug, you'd like to kick off.
Well, as a Brit who grew up during the late 40s and 1950s, I first heard of Stirling Moss when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, about 5 years old. And by the time I was 6 years old, it was largely because of his exploits that I was completely hooked on motorsport. So he is entirely single-handedly responsible for ruining my life ever after, along with so many other enthusiasts, and not only Brits, because Stirling became absolutely the standard-setting racing driver of his era. Once his great mentor and friend, Juan Manuel Fangio, had retired, and I started out as a fan, and well, I know we ended up as friends, and sometimes if we were larking about somewhere, I had to pinch myself to think, well, hang on a minute, this is the man that when I was tiny, I would talk about him as Stirling Moss, because I couldn't pronounce Stirling. And with his completely inseparable and devoted wife, Susie, he became a major part of all the Goodwood meetings that I've been involved in since we started them in 1993. So that, for me, is Stirling, just Mr. Motor Racing.
Bill, you've had him, I think, as the only 2-time honoured guest at Amelia Island.
Yeah. Unlike Doug, I haven't grown up yet, but living here in Jacksonville, the proximity to Sebring was always attractive. So as a young man, my father, who was a fisherman, could care less about automobiles. But once I became 16 and mobile, I would go to the races. And the first time I saw Sir Stirling Drive was at Sebring, I think 1960. And he was always my hero. He and Juan Fangio. We used to have an acre of land. I used to have to mow it with a hand mower. So I would fantasize that I raced against Fangio and Moss when I was about 12 years old, never thinking that we would become friends over the years, but we did. And we did a number of things together to which every moment was magic. And like Doug, I said, you know, I would pinch myself every time I was with Susie and Stirling, because it was like we were with old friends. He had a real knack of making you feel comfortable, and he was the epitome of British charm. I miss him to this day. he and I drove a couple of races with Ennis Ireland, who drove with Stirling several times, and those two are irreplaceable.
Philip, thank you.
Well, Doug has very eloquently really expressed my story as well with regard to Stirling. I also, like every British schoolboy in the 50s, Stirling was my great hero. I was fortunate to go with my parents to Silverstone in 1956 at the age of 5 to see the International Trophy meeting, which of course Stirling won in the Van Wall, first major victory for the Van Wall. And I think I was an absolute total pain with my parents and their friends, because every time Stirling went past, every lap, whether it was the single-seater race or the sports car race, in which he was in the DB3S, I leant over and said, and pointed out, look, Stirling, and so on. So he was my great hero, and for many, many years. And then we met in various ways. I interviewed him a number of times, and then he became a patron of our XK club. He took on the role strictly on a non-participatory basis, old boy, and then came to every one of our dinners every year at the annual dinners at House of Commons, and was wonderful. I would interview him after dinner. We had a lot of laughs. It was a lot of humour. And so I got to know him very well, suggested doing some books based on his scrapbooks. He said, and I quote, "I think you're crazy, but okay." We did 4 together and so on. So it was wonderful. And as Doug said, we became great friends. I couldn't believe it. My hero, all these years further on, that we were now great friends. I think it was not only that he was such an exceptional sportsman, so brilliant in all types of car, but he was also a fantastic sportsman as well as a total professional. And so he was utterly exceptional in so many ways, all with, as has been said, a lovely sense of humour.
Oh, thank you for that, Philip. I also had Stirling Moss as a hero, because I remember at prep school we had one individual there who produced a copy of Motorsport magazine at some stage. We'd never seen it before. And there, Dennis Jenkinson, known as Jenks, who'd been his navigator in that 1955 Mille Miglia victory in 300 SLR Mercedes, he wrote a story about that whole going down to recce the course and winning the race. And Stirling became an instant hero for me in what I think is probably the ultimate motorsport victory of all time in any form of motorsport. Yeah. I think you possibly all agree with me, I don't know. So thank you very much, gentlemen, for those opinions. We'll now move on then, I think, to bringing up our cars that are entered in this particular part of the virtual concours. So, gentlemen, who'd like to go first? Well, should we keep the same order? Might as well. Doug, would you like to pronounce on this machine?
Pronounce on this machine? Yeah.
Sorry, that's English first. What have you got to say then?
Yeah, Stirling had a kind of love-hate relationship with Ferrari, in that back in 1951 he was invited to drive for them, and when he arrived for the drive, which he was absolutely thrilled to take on at Bari, the car that he thought he was going to be driving had actually been given to Piero Taruffi instead, and nobody had bothered to tell him. So what had been an instant love affair became years and years of hating Ferrari, and he really enjoyed nothing better than beating them. And slowly he was weaned back onto driving Ferraris, and really it was the 250 GT short wheelbase like this car that cemented, well, at least the start of what should have been, or could have been, a wonderful relationship. Old man Ferrari needed Stirling Moss as the world's greatest racing driver, and Stirling didn't really need Ferrari. except in the GT World Championship, which paid well, old boy. 50 quid a race, I tell you, big money. And of course, that kind of thing always riveted Stirling's complete attention. And he drove two different 250 GT short wheelbases in the 1960 and 61 Goodwood TTs and won them both. And they were liveried like this in Rob Walker's Scots blue colours with the white band over the nose. He also drove one of the cars at Le Mans, and it broke when they were leading their class by miles, simply because in preparation they'd left the street fan on it, and the fan shed a blade and it cut through a radiator hose and damaged the engine through overheating. But great car. It was a car that he thoroughly enjoyed driving and that essentially he loved. And he should have driven a GTO in 1962, but unfortunately he suffered his career-ending crash at Goodwood on Easter Monday instead. But very, very important car and a lovely car. I know that short wheelbases are a special favourite of yours, Alan, aren't they?
Well, they are indeed, Doug, and I have to tell you, I did drive this car for its owner way back and expressed my total delight with it. And he said, well, you can buy it if you like. And I did. I think it was 1,500 quid, which was more than enough at the time. Bill, you've seen this car before, haven't you?
Yeah, and in fact, as Doug so well pointed out, there were two of them in the same livery, back to back. I guess Ross Braun owns one of them now. I don't know where the other one is.
That's this one with the radio aerial. That's Ross's.
Yeah. In fact, he listened to the race on the radio, as I'm told, to entertain himself. If we're talking Crumpet cars, it's got to be a car that seats two. So it narrows our choice down. But to me, the short wheelbase Berlinetta is probably the epitome of closed Ferraris, of all closed Ferraris. The Series 1 Cabriolet is the best of the open. But I love short wheelbases. I've driven them. They're nimble, they're quick, they're everything you want in a car. He was so successful in this car, and he also drove the. Doug, you're talking about the GTO. We had the GTO that was to be delivered to him when he crashed.
The pale green one.
Yeah,
yes.
He's got. He was to drive a GTO, but he did drive the prototype, the aerodynamic coupe that he finished third at the Daytona Continental behind Dan Gurney in the Lotus 19, and so it seemed like at that time he was feeling better about driving Ferraris, particularly the GT cars. And as Crumpet cars go, of this whole group, it was between this and probably the E-Type. But if we're talking about cars that are the most significant to Stirling Moss, it's got to be 722. But we'll get to that later.
Yes, that will be coming up. Philip, I think you know this car rather well too.
Well, I do, but I think your two distinguished guests have already said virtually everything I might have said. Doug certainly should know the car because he wrote a book for our Great Car series. I happen to have one up here. And it's an extraordinary car, exceptional, wonderful pedigree. And of course, it also did a number of club events in the UK, if I remember correctly, very successfully with Stirling. And so on, and great that Ross Braun, who's such an enthusiast, should own this car. Very special, stunning looks, of course, with performance to match. Fantastic.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I think upon that, we will move on sprightly. Philip, you might like to start us off, as I believe you know this car, well, not as well as you should, but you've experienced it.
Well, I have to declare an interest here. I've owned this car since 1976. It is, with respect, Doug, a 1960 car because it was a prototype.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, built in August 1960. So it's the oldest E-Type in existence. It was used for prototype testing, development work, driven largely by Norman Jewett, of course, at Maurer, etc. It was then lent to various members of the press pre-launch, which took place in March in Geneva, of course. Pre-launch, so the newspapers like the Daily Telegraph and the Times, etc., were able to write about it on the day of launch. And Autocar had borrowed it, and Maurice Smith, the then editor, had managed to just achieve a proper timed 150 miles an hour, which Jaguar are claiming the E-Type would do, but actually wouldn't quite. So to be completely nerdy and anorak, you will notice in the photograph a lack of overriders and a motif bar in the mouth of the bonnet. They were worth 2 or 3 miles an hour, and so they were taken off to enable the speed to be achieved. It was left-hand driver initially, used as the press car after launch, and then Jaguar at the end of '61 converted it to right-hand drive. And it had some interesting owners, a chap called John Paddy Carstairs, who was an amazing character, screenwriter, artist, novelist, and so on, extraordinary man. And then one Jack Fairman, who owned it for a few years and advertised it for sale in Autosport. £750 will never go down in value. And Stirling's connection with this car is that he featured in a Pathy News video film at the time of the launch, '61, demonstrating taking the car through London's first car wash, automatic car wash, which was about 5 chaps with sponges who the car would be on a sort of chain through this enclosure. These chaps would jump on it with sponges and go like, etc., and then it'd be pulled out the other side. And here we have Stirling's car finished and really painted and finished and washed and looking spick and span. Although, frankly, I thought it looked good before it arrived. And that was the sort of Pathy News coverage. And then subsequently, many years later, when we were at Prescott for a charity event, Stirling drove it up, which was, of course, for me, very, very special. So that's a bit about 960 HP.
Okay, I'm going to say time's up, Philip, because this is unfair on the other competitors, I think. That Doug or Bill, have you got anything you might like to put in there to assist prior to us moving on?
Nothing. The only thing I would say is that it's a car that made Brits very, very proud. And that was an aspect that to Stirling was always hugely important. He loved waving the Union Jack. And he was a genuinely patriotic person, and it was genuinely important to him.
Yeah, that's very true indeed, and very
The
notable.
other thing I would suggest is photoshopping the little head off the roof. Is this the car that Norman Jewett drove to the Geneva Auto Show?
No, he followed a few days later in a different car. Bob drove this one flat out, arriving with 20 minutes to spare. And Land said, "What kept you, Berry?"
Let's move on, shall we then? We'll choose another phenomenal ex-Stirling machine. Okay, Doug, maybe you care to tell us what you know about, I see wah wheels on the front and mag wheels on the rear, the van wall.
Yeah, when I was a kid, initially, British Formula One teams or Grand Prix teams were hopeless, and all they were able to do was pick up the dregs, really, pick up the crumbs that fell from the table that was occupied by Ferrari and Maserati and Mercedes-Benz. And then slowly, our industry, specialist racing industry, progressed to a level where we became competitive, and the van war was the most competitive of them all. And that was entirely down to one man, and that was Guy Anthony Vandervelde, Tony Vandervelde, who ran the Vandervelde Bearings Company, making thin wall bearings under license from Cleveland in America. And he was very successful. He actually supplied Ferrari with their bearings, which made the V12 engine the great success it became. But he longed, as he put it, to beat those bloody red cars. And of course, with Stirling's early mindset, he was very happy to help Van der Velde do that, as long as the car was fast enough and reliable enough. And when Mercedes retired from racing at the end of 55, Stirling tested 3 British cars to see if any of them had the potential to become a winner. And he tested the Van Wall, the Connaught, and the BRM. And the Van Wall was the fastest, and he did one race, which was the race that Philip was talking about earlier, the International Trophy at Silverstone, in the first of these teardrop-shaped Van Walls. There was an earlier Van Wall, but this one had a redesigned chassis done by Colin Chapman, and that aerodynamic body, that teardrop body, done by the Lotus aerodynamicist, Frank Costin. And Stirling flew in that race and won it. But he'd already signed up with Maserati for 1956. And at the end of 56, he finally joined Van Wall. They started winning, he and Tony Brooks, great driver, who Stirling always characterised as being the greatest unknown racing driver of all time. Because Tony, dear old Tony, was such a retiring character, he wouldn't promote himself or project himself in the way that came naturally to Stirling. And they started winning with the British Grand Prix in the middle of 57. And in 1958, they won Grand Prix between them. And Van Wall became the first British constructor to win the Formula One Constructors' Championship. So this is a very, very important car. And to me, you know, at the time, I mean, crikey, I was one of the biggest, 13-year-old Van Wall fans you could possibly imagine. And subsequently, I got to drive the Collier Collection car several times in various events. Stirling was absolutely right. It's got a lousy gearbox, but the rest of it is just fantastic. What a lovely thing.
I remember you interviewed both Moss and Tony Brooks up at Bonham's in Bond Street. One of the most exciting meetings, BRDC meeting, I think, I've ever been to before. And these two gentlemen stood up and described how it was, 50 years after they'd won the British Grand Prix at Aintree. They were just telling us in the room, verbatim, how they did it. I thought it was the most splendid thing I'd ever been to of that nature.
It was magic, wasn't it?
You interviewed him, yeah. It was. I've never forgotten it. It was that special. Did you have this car over when Stirling came to be your guest on either occasion, Bill?
Yeah, we had a Van Wall. If that's the Revs car, then that's the one we had.
The Collier car.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I guess there's 2 remaining, the Collier car and one other. I think if you had to nail that.
Yeah, well, some more have been built since, Bill.
Of every car.
Oh, absolutely.
There was only one original, I think, that came up for auction. I drove it for some Swedish guy who bought it, and the engine failed, and John Surtees said he'd had something to do with the building of it. He said, "Oh, we just got an old engine and slung it in there. You know, God knows how many races it had done. I'm not surprised it went wrong." Because it wasn't being taken seriously as a competitive front-engine Grand Prix car.
No, there was only one surviving, fully surviving Van Wall from period, and that car is now in the Ecclestone collection.
Okay.
Yes, That's correct. Whether this has come from him or not, I don't know. The beauty of these replicas is, if this is one, you can't really tell the difference. Certainly not from a photograph. Anyway, we'll move on if that's all right, as we are a little pressured for time as usual. Let's find another one of these gorgeous Sir Stirling motors.
Well, I was looking up in one of the scrapbooks to remind myself what Stirling made of all this. He did it because he wanted to do something a bit different and sort of, as it were, have this on his CV, having done, of course, rallying as well as, and some record breaking, but nothing very too serious. And this was the sort of ultimate iteration of the various MG EX streamlined record breakers. Goldie Gardner had driven the earlier ones, etc. And he went out to the salt flats at Utah. It was too wet initially to run, but eventually after a day or so, they were able to. And he described it as a bit dicey. It was a bit hairy, I think. Won't bore you with too much detail, but he achieved the figure of 245 miles per hour, which was pretty impressive. I think everybody was very happy with it.
It had a supercharged...
I have to just add, as Bill was saying earlier on, before we started, bearing in mind this is meant to be a Crumpet car, where do you fit the Crumpet?
He'd find a way.
He told me that the one thing that made him very uncomfortable about that car, that if something went wrong, there was no possible way of getting out of it.
That's right.
You know, without a system.
Fasteners around the...
One guy who you may remember, who retired to Amelia Island, and we had him at the show a number of times. He was at the show up until his death, was Gus Ehrman. And he was part of the record team out there too. Now, also Phil Hill drove this car, if I remember correctly.
Exactly.
Right.
He went through the 250-mile-an-hour barrier in it, I think.
That's right. They increased the power slightly by that stage, another 10 horsepower, brake horsepower.
A spectacular and important car. I don't know how many Crumpets it would attract, though.
That was a wonderful thing. At the Collier Connoisseurship Symposium one year, I ran an MG film that showed the car running, and then Stirling arriving to drive the car once it was set up for the salt flats. And the commentary said that after initial running by the American test driver, Stirling Moss took over. And Phil grunted and said, some test driver. But you're quite right about the fact that the drivers felt trapped within it, because once they were under the bubble and the front body section was fastened down, they couldn't actually release it from inside the car.
No.
They could only escape with outside help. And when Phil was driving the car, a pipe cracked and the cockpit filled with methanol fumes, and he was nearly gassed. He was nearly asphyxiated before the crew arrived to open it up and give him a breath of fresh air.
It took 3 miles. Three miles to stop it. It had one single rear disc brake, and it took 3 miles to stop.
Yes.
Yes. I don't suppose this car would legally be allowed to be driven seriously today then. The National State and Safety First would disallow it, would they not?
And that was the MG slogan, wasn't it? Safety first.
Yeah. Safety fast.
Except for this one.
Yes. Well, phenomenal car, and very, very nice seeing it in our show. Let's move on. We'll go on to another vehicle.
Probably the greatest race car of all times.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
go along with that.
Even if you've got O-level English, it's difficult to find the words to eulogize this car and the two gentlemen seated therein. It was the most phenomenal motorsport act of all time.
Well, you know, I think it's more transcends that. I think not only is it the greatest motorsport achievement, it's one of the greatest sporting achievements of all time, along with things like the 4-minute mile. It's in that sort of scale, in my opinion.
Yes.
I think you're absolutely right, Philip. It's certainly the greatest single day race drive in history.
Mm.
Yeah.
You look at the photo of Stirling. Every time you see him in a race car, and I think I sent some photos over to you, Alan, of him in the Aston or in the birdcage. He always looked relaxed. You could say intense, but not so much intense as it was relaxed.
Mm.
Very true. Very true.
Well, he came from a generation that, as I always put it, delivered the goods. In other words, failure did take place, but it wasn't successful. In other words, I think there's a rather famous saying that courage is going from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. That was Winston Churchill who pronounced that. And I think that both Jenks and Stirling fitted the bill perfectly. Yeah, they had failures from time to time, but that didn't stop them going for further results with unlimited enthusiasm. And I learned plenty from that. I mean, Churchill said a lot of things, and I must admit, I do tend to agree with most of them.
I was trying to think of the last time he drove that car, and we had him over in, I think it was 2020. No,
that's
2015. And we took the car out to the D-Dot Ranch, Dan Davis's ranch, and Petrolicious did a whole thing of him driving that car. I'm wondering if that was the last time he drove that car. Does anybody know?
Well,
Probably would be.
we had a session at Goodwood, which I was involved in, and the factory sent the original 722 over to Goodwood for him to drive. And he's thundering round. He's thundering round in the car, and he comes in the pits, and he says to me, "Hop in, old boy. Have a run." And as I was going down the back straight, the Lavant straight, Stirling's in full charge mode. And he balls out in this lovely, lovely car. And I couldn't help but look sideways. And I thought, oh, let's hope he doesn't have anything go wrong with his own fuel system, his fuel pump pack up or something. And then I thought, well, there's worse ways to die than in 722 being driven by the man who won the 55 millimeter in the very same car. And the strange thing is, I get into the pits and I hop out. And one of my best friends is standing there and he says, "Good God, you lucky thing. What was that like? What was that like?" So I said, "Stirling, can you give this guy a lift?" So yeah, hop in, old boy, hop in, old boy. So my friend hops in 722, round they go. Well, 3 laps later, he comes into the pits and we had to help him out of the car. And it transpires that he too felt going down the straight, let's hope Stirling doesn't have a mishap. And that it didn't really matter if he did, because there's far worse ways to go than that. But Stirling loved it. I don't think till the very end of his days he ever gave up that instant competitive spirit just to be involved in a competition of some kind. He loved his vintage racing all the time he was doing that. And he has made the most remarkable contribution, I think, the finest ambassador to motorsport that not only Great Britain, but really motorsport itself ever could have had. Now, I think we can say quite a lot about the Lotus 18. He won the Monaco Grand Prix in one of these in 1960. And what I think is considered one of the greatest races, actual track races of all time, was his win in 1961 at Monaco in a Lotus 18. The 1.5 litre formula in 61, 2.5 litre formula in 60.
Same car, notionally.
That car was what? It was a year old when it won there, or 2 years old?
It was in its first year in 1960, and in its second year in 61.
And Stirling won.
Was it the same actual car, merely with an engine change? I've always thought it was, but I may be wrong.
Same frame. Same frame.
It was. Good Lord. So that's a 2 times Monaco Grand Prix winning car then, in 2 different formulas.
And that frame, of course, as people perhaps don't always realise, on the grid before the 61 race, a crack was discovered in one of the tubes in the frame, and the great Alf Francis welded it up on the grid.
The chief mechanic.
Yes. Absolutely.
Did he really? Good Lord.
And then, in spite of all that, Stirling got in and drove one of the races of his life, as you say, against three more powerful Ferraris, the shark-nosed Ferraris, which continually attacked him. Ginther, Phil Hill, Von Trips, and he withstood that onslaught all the way through. And of course, a low-speed driver's circuit and sheer skill. It was just sheer skill, not power. And that just showed how absolutely extraordinary and preeminent Stirling was. And then subsequently, another great race. He won the German Grand Prix in that car as well, same year.
He was
After that Monaco race in '61, Stirling wrote in his diary, "My greatest race." And he was below his fastest practice lap for most of the laps through the Grand Prix, trying to keep the Ferraris behind him.
Yes, the race average was quicker than his fastest lap the year before.
The antithesis,
out, wasn't he, the whole way round for that race? I think he was 10 tenths for every single lap.
Mm. The other side of that story is Phil Hill's recollection of that race, where he said it was like trying to see what's faster around a living room, a terrier dog or a racehorse. Terrier dog.
Yeah. Well, I think it's gone down in history as one of the all-time spectacular feats. I suppose that really tells us about the phenomenal versatility that Stirling had as a driver. I mean, on any given day, at any given track, he could drive any given vehicle. And I would imagine that people would look at the kind of lap times that he produced as being the ultimate that car could do on that track on that day. He extracted the most on every occasion, which is what made him so special.
And I think during that period, all the other drivers, Doug will perhaps confirm this, looked up to him. He was, without doubt, in a league of his own. He was the maestro. He'd taken over from Fangio. There was no question. Stirling was the best.
His was the lap time after a practice session. His was the lap time they would first look at or look for to see what he'd done.
Yes.
No question.
There's very few drivers in the history of motorsport that other drivers go to watch whilst practicing to see if they can pick up a tip. I know Nuvolari was one of them. Rennie Dreyfus told me that they all used to go and watch him to try and improve their own performance. And certainly Stirling was much watched by other drivers. Mind you, so was Jim Clark, of course, and I'm sure Ayrton Senna to boot. But it's a rare thing for other drivers to go out and try and get a lesson off another driver by watching him.
Jonathan Williams, who ultimately became a Ferrari works driver for a brief period, told me of a Guards Trophy race practice. No, that's wrong. It was a Kentish 100 Formula 2 race practice at Brands Hatch that he went to watch as an enthusiastic schoolboy. And Stirling Moss came round in his Rob Walker Cooper, as it then was, on completely different line to everybody else, looking bog slow. And then the PA announced that Stirling had just set the fastest lap and he qualified the car on pole. And as Bill was saying, that style could be very, very deceptive because he might have been relaxed, but it's because he wasn't quite slowing down as much as the next guy. And he was accelerating more quickly than the next guy, probably earlier around the corner than the next guy. And that relaxed style really made people like young Jonathan in those days think, hey, he's bog slow. And he wasn't. He was smooth.
Yeah, when we think about this particular car, what comes to mind to me was he was an independent in this car who beat every one of the factory cars.
He loved the role of
year-old car.
Well, this is exactly when Jim Clark was starting to appear. I think it was the Lotus 21 that came after this 18.
Correct. Yeah.
And of course, once the 24s came around, and then that monocoque 25, I mean, well, Stirling had disappeared by then, but...
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but that chassis was also a Formula Junior, a Formula 2, and a Formula 1, depending on just what motor you dropped in it, right?
Not quite. The Formula Junior chassis was, of an 18 was very similar, although they were all called Lotus 18.
Yeah.
There were differences, and the chassis was substantially more hefty and stiffer and more rugged in the Formula 1 and 2 cars.
I'm confused about this one. Perhaps Doug can clarify, or Bill, or yourself, but it's been described here as an MG Tajiro, but the car that Stirling drove, and I think this started life perhaps as...
I don't remember him driving a Tajiro.
No, it was the Leonard MG that Stirling drove, which was later on, I think, rebodied or rebuilt, and John Tajiro then was involved, and a car was built in a similar way. But my understanding is that this was the car he drove, as I say, was the Leonard MG.
This is Loy 501. Look, there's a Loy 500 as well, I remember. That was the famous Tajiro. But are you saying that you don't think that Stirling appeared in this particular car then?
Loy 501, that's the car that he drove. That's quite right. And Lionel Leonard, he says in a certain book, was a good friend. He was a tulip bulb importer,
right,
and a great racing enthusiast who travelled with us when we were racing the Kieft in Europe in 1951. Then he built up this MG, asked Stirling to drive it, and it was called a Leonard MG. No, that's where the Tajiro bit threw me.
Exactly.
And he finished third in his heat and retired in the final. My diary tells me that the car handled nicely but lacked power. And when the crank broke in the final, I was lying second in class. C'est la vie.
Well, yes, thank you for that. Well, gentlemen, I think we've done what we were asked to do. We've been through all the cars that basically are up for competition. And I think, therefore, it would be my duty now to bring this particular gathering to a close. Would any of you like to have a final say on what we have just done? I think we've completed our remit. We talked about Stirling and we talked about his cars. Anybody have a final word they'd like to put in before we say goodbye?
I'd like to just quickly share a little story, if I may. Bear in mind the name Crumpet. The word trumpet is in the title, which of course was Stirling's favourite word. I remember being at Goodwood Revival a few years ago when he was celebrating, I guess it'd be his 70th birthday, Doug, and Damon Hill was there dressed as a chauffeur with a Marilyn Monroe lookalike and a big open Cadillac. And they did a lap or two, and then they came in, and it had been raining, then dry, it had been raining, so there were some puddles around, and they happened to stop right by where I was standing in the paddock. And Stirling very gallantly lifted the Marilyn Monroe out of the car and placed her gently on the ground. And I heard him mutter, and I was close enough, and I don't think anybody else heard this, but I heard him mutter to himself, just like the old boy, just like the old days. Drop them immediately. Pick them up, drop them immediately.
I think we'd have to say that Susie was probably the most patient wife anybody's ever had.
And Stirling was the least PC person on this earth.
I tell you what, when it comes down to it, as long as people are still interested in these old cars, anything that was raced in period by Moss will be regarded as being a really special artifact, something really to be cherished.
Absolutely.
That's what Stirling was.
Here, here.
Yes, nobly put. I think that basically says it all.
Yeah,
It was definitely something to be cherished. And I think, in fact, he's left behind a legacy that cannot be fulfilled by anybody else. And weren't we lucky to have known him and shared, I think, his ambassadorship for motor racing, especially British motor racing.
It was a tremendous privilege.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen, for your contributions. I think we've done a very tasty job indeed, and I hope that others watching it will enjoy it. And hopefully this will be around for some considerable time, and future writers of books and people interested in this period in motorsport history will find what we've had to say interesting, in which case I think, have fulfilled our duty and our job. Thank you.
Good. I've got to go and cook now.
Yes.
Thank you. I feel honored to be in your presence. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill. Nice to see you. Keep well, everybody.
Thank you.
Bill.
Absolutely. Good to see you.
Farewell, gentlemen.
Bye, chaps.